Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we venture into the hidden corridors of church history where a woman's voice once rang out as a teacher and leader, only to be muffled by those in power. Mary Magdalene walked beside Jesus, bore witness to his greatest mysteries, and yet her true story was buried beneath centuries of patriarchal decree. We'll uncover both the sacred beauty of her devotion and the shadows cast by those who feared her influence. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you found yourself genuinely captivated by these tales. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Your comments light up this global community. Now, dim the lights. Let a soft breeze of white noise carry you, and prepare to listen to a story of faith, power, and the silenced apostle whose truth still whispers today. In the years following the life of Jesus of Nazareth, a body of writings emerged among early Christian communities that preserved threads of teaching not found in the four canonical Gospels. Among these was a document known today as the Gospel of Mary, composed in Greek sometime between 150 and 200 CE, and later translated into Coptic in the mid-3rd century. Only fragments of this text survived, most famously a papyrus codex discovered in Cairo in 1896, and now preserved in Berlin yet. It portrays Mary Magdalene not as a penitent sinner, but as an intimate confidant and interpreter of Jesus' esoteric instruction. By the 4th century, as bishops and church councils across the Roman Empire moved to define orthodoxy, texts like this one were deemed heretical. At the Council of Laodicea, around 363 CE, admonitions were recorded against apocryphal writings, and later church fathers such as Epiphanius of Salamis, 315-403 CE, castigated Gnostic Gospels in long treatises. The definitive canon of the New Testament was virtually settled by the time of Pope Damasus I in 382 CE, whose commissioned Vulgate would further marginalize non-canonical works. Imperial and papal injunctions ensured that any remaining copies of the Gospel of Mary were hunted down, hidden, or destroyed, relegating Mary's own words to the shadows of ecclesial memory. Despite this systematic erasure, whispers of her leadership persisted in mystical traditions and marginal annals. In the centuries that followed, Mary Magdalene would be recast in popular lore as a repentant prostitutea distortion that served to obscure her true influence. And so, the woman whom Jesus entrusted with the first proclamation of the resurrection would be buried beneath layers of legend, her authentic testimony all but silenced by those who feared a female apostle's authority. Mary of Magdala was born in the first decades of the 1st century CE in a small fishing town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, known today by archaeologists as Magdala. Excavations there have revealed a thriving Jewish community with stone docks, ritual baths, and a bustling marketplace for fish and agricultural produce. It is likely that Mary grew up in a household connected to the local fisheries trade, a milieu that shaped her strength and resilience long before she became a follower of Jesus. Jewish women of her time could own property and manage businesses under Roman law, and while the Gospels refer to Mary simply as Magdalene, the name signifies both her origin and her prominence within that community. Sometime in her late 20s or early 30s, she encountered Jesus of Nazareth during his Galilean ministry and itinerant teacher, whose message of repentance, healing, and imminent kingdom would have resonated across social boundaries. The canonical Gospels mention that 7 demons were cast out of her, using language common to the period to describe what we might today understand as profound spiritual or psychological transformation. Rather than relegating her to the margins, Jesus' act of healing seems to have empowered Mary to leave behind her former life and accompany him on his journeys to Jerusalem and beyond. By walking the dusty roads alongside him and the 12, she earned an elevated status that challenged contemporary norms about female piety and leadership. Her intimate knowledge of Jewish scripture and her bold witness at critical moments, such as the foot of the cross, suggest that she was more than a passive observer. Early Christian writers like Hippolytus of Rome and Codex Pistis Sophia portray Mary as an interpreter of secret teachings, entrusted with insight into the mysteries that even Peter and John craved. Yet as the Church institutionalized, her Galilean origins were deemed inconvenient. The same community that revered her as apostle to the apostles saw fit to strip away her authority and reduce her to a cautionary footnote in patriarchal lore. The first recorded miracle of Jesus of Nazareth unfolded at a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, an event preserved uniquely in the Gospel of John, which scholars date to around the turn of the 1st century CE, likely between 90 and 100 AD. In that account, Mary of Magdala appears not as a peripheral guest, but as an intermediary whose quiet confidence set the divine work in motion. The text tells us that when the household ran out of Winnie, serious social faux pas that could bring shame upon the host, Mary approached her son and spoke simply, "They have no more wine." In the cultural context of a Jewish wedding, where hospitality was sacred, this moment carries profound weight. By entrusting her son with the needs of others, Mary demonstrated a level of faith and authority unusual for women of her time. Jesus' response, though initially seeming hesitant, ultimately led to the transformation of 6 stone water jars each, holding 120 to 150 liters into fine wine, a feat that would have required both miraculous power and deliberate ceremony. The number 6 held ritual significance, echoing purity laws in the Torah. Ancient commentators, including Origen in the 3rd century CE, saw in this act a symbol of the new covenant replacing the old. Yet, as the church hierarchy developed, early theologians who emphasized male discipleship found such feminine initiative problematic. Mary's pivotal role in this first public sign was downplayed or omitted in later retellings. Her intervention, which underscored a collaborative relationship between mother and teacher, challenged prevailing gender roles within emerging ecclesial structures. Even though the miracle at Cana cemented Jesus' messianic identity for his followers, Mary's contribution was all but erased in the authoritative liturgical readings of the medieval Latin Rite. It would take rediscovery of apocryphal traditions and modern feminist exegesis for her decisive act of intercession to regain scholarly recognition. As Jesus traveled from Galilee to Jerusalem during the late 20s and early 30s CE, he gathered a group of disciples whose backgrounds ranged from fishermen to tax collectors. Among this cadre of 12 men, Mary of Magdala occupied an extraordinary position, one that the surviving canonical texts hint at but seldom explore in depth. In the Gospel of Luke, composed around 80 to 90 CE, we read that Mary and other women supported Jesus' ministry with their resources and presence. Yet, in the more philosophically inclined Gospel of John, likely finalized near the end of the 1st century, Mary's knowledge of his teachings is suggested by her confident intercession at Cana. Outside of these references, the apocryphal Acts of Philip, written in Greek during the 3rd century CE, portrays Mary addressing the other apostles, teaching them insights that surpassed even Peter's understanding. Church fathers, such as Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, acknowledged that diverse Christian communities preserved traditions in which Mary played a leading role, yet these accounts were labeled unorthodox by the growing episcopal authorities. The implication is clear. Early Christianity may have included a more egalitarian circle of followers than the later patriarchal hierarchy would tolerate. Mary's proximity to Jesus, her involvement in private dialogues, and her unique interpretive authority appear in fragments of Gnostic manuscripts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945. While these documents date from the mid to late 3rd century, they likely preserve traditions that emerged within decades of Jesus' death. By the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under Emperor Constantine, the leadership and the identity of who could teach the faith had become strictly defined. As bishops convened to establish a unified doctrine, the memory of a woman standing shoulder to shoulder with the 12 was deemed unsuitable for the public face of the Church. In the centuries that followed, hagiographies recast Mary as a redeemed sinner rather than an insider to the divine mysteries, and her role as teacher was scoured from official histories. Yet the surviving traces of her voice among this inner circle reveal a more complex and inclusive origin for the earliest Christian movement. Late in the evening, when the streets of Jerusalem lay quiet under a crescent moon and flickering oil lamps cast trembling shadows against ancient stones, Mary of Magdala slipped away from the circle of Jesus' companions to a secluded corner of the olive grove known as Gethsemane. It was there, according to the Gospel of Matthew, written around 80 to 90 CE, that Jesus himself retreated to pray in anguished solitude before his arrest. Yet the canonical account notes that only the mother of Zebedee's sons and the other Mary remain at a cautious distance. Apocryphal traditions preserved in the Pistis Sophia, a Gnostic text compiled in Greek during the 3rd century CE and later translated into Coptic, suggest it was Mary of Magdala who stood closest, her cloak wet with dew, her heart bound to her teacher's fate. In the stillness of that night, she is said to have offered prayers of intercession for Jesus' strength, reciting psalms learned in her youth and invoking language of lament found in the Book of Lamentations. Her words are lost to history, yet they must have echoed across the grove, threading mercy through the rustling leaves. Early Christian mystics like Origen and Tertullian wrote of secret remembrances in which Mary's presence in Gethsemane marked her as not just a witness, but a companion in suffering, sharing Christ's burden in ways that men of the 12 allegedly could not comprehend. As the Council at Nicaea in 325 CE codified the roles of clergy and laity, any hint of a woman praying alongside Jesus at his darkest hour became theologically inconvenient. Monastic rulebooks from the 5th century prescribed silence and withdrawal for women mystics, effectively banning them from public liturgy. Still, hidden manuscripts and secret convent ruins bear witness to a lost tradition wherein Mary's midnight prayers were commemorated as acts of courage and spiritual intimacy. In those whispered legacies lies a portrait of a woman whose faith did not falter in the face of betrayal and whose voice, though suppressed, continues to murmur through the annals of early Christianity. On the night of Passover, in the year 30 or 31 of the Common Era, Jesus and his followers gathered in an upper room in Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Synoptic Gospels, composed between 60 and 90 CE, recount how, after sharing bread and wine, Jesus led his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. There, under ancient olive trees whose gnarled trunks would bear silent witness, a figure emerged from the shadows with a band of soldiers and temple guards. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, approached Jesus and greeted him with a kiss. This act of intimacy became the mark of betrayal. Canonical accounts name Peter, once bold enough to draw a sword, and John, whom Jesus loved, as key witnesses, yet the Gnostic Gospel of Mary, dating to the 2nd century, implies that Mary Magdalene remained closer than any of the others. While the soldiers seized Jesus by the wrist and bound him for trial before the high priest Caiaphas, Mary is said to have stepped forward, her voice a clarion call of protest. Ancient commentaries by Clement of Alexandria and Hippolytus of Rome note that women were not permitted to testify in the council's proceedings. Yet Mary's presence at that moment speaks of courage that transcended legal barriers. According to the Gospel of Peter, an apocryphal text perhaps written in the 3rd century, Mary's tears fell on the Roman sandals as she pleaded for her teacher. Though the text was rejected by church authorities in the 4th century, it reveals how strongly early communities felt her solidarity. In subsequent centuries, ecclesiastical writers recast this scene, replacing her defiant grief with silent lament at a distance. By the time canon law prohibited women from bearing witness in church courts, the memory of Mary raising her voice in defense of Jesus had all but vanished from official liturgy. Yet, through the centuries, hidden codices preserved fragments of her protest, reminding us that when betrayal struck, a woman's faith stood unshaken even as the world around her fractured. On a hill outside Jerusalem, known as Golgotha or Calvary, during the morning hours of a spring Friday in approximately 31 CE, Jesus of Nazareth was led to his execution beneath the weight of Roman authority. The Gospel of Mark, composed around 60 to 70 CE, describes Mary of Magdala standing near the foot of the cross alongside other women, her grief mingling with indignation as onlookers jeered and soldiers cast lots for Jesus' garments. In the Gospel of John, finalized near the close of the 1st century CE, Jesus entrusts the care of his mother to the beloved disciple before addressing Mary by name, giving her to all followers as a spiritual mother. This intimate exchange underscores the depth of their bond. Early Christian poetesses quoted by church fathers like Gregory Nazianzen in the 4th century CE preserved hymns, suggesting Mary's voice rose in lament, echoing language from the Psalms and Lamentations, as she bore witness to both divine sacrifice and human cruelty. The authenticity of these verses cannot be confirmed, yet they reveal how early communities revered Mary, not merely as a mourner, but as an interpreter of the Passion's meaning. Despite this, by the time of the Latin Vulgate translation completed by Jerome in 405 CE, liturgical emphasis shifted to John's male disciple, and Mary's presence was reframed into a singular moment of silent sorrow rather than active engagement. Canon law established under Pope Gelasius I in 494 CE restricted women from teaching or leading public prayer effectively sealing Mary's role behind the veil of personal devotion. Over subsequent centuries, art and sermon alike portrayed Mary as a distant figure in black robes, tears streaming without voice. Yet archaeological discoveries of early Christian inscriptions in the catacombs of Rome reveal images of a woman at the cross bearing a scroll, a symbol of prophetic testimony. In those hidden galleries, her courage endures in the silence of stone, reminding us that at the darkest hour she remained steadfast, interpreting the crucifixion in a way that would echo through generations even as her story was obscured. At dawn on the third day following the crucifixion in the spring of 31 or 32 of the Common Era, Mary of Magdala rose before the sun and walked through the dew-soaked garden toward the tomb where Jesus of Nazareth had been laid. The Gospel of Mark, written around 60 to 70 CE, records that Mary arrived while it was still dark and saw the stone rolled away. In the Gospel of John, composed nearer to the close of the 1st century CE, we learn that Mary stooped to look inside and beheld 2 angels in white, seated where the body had lain. Distracted by their question and overcome with grief, she turned and saw a gardener standing nearby, his figure clad in simple robes and bearing a gentle countenance. Only when he spoke her name did she recognize the risen Christ standing before her. He entrusted to her the commission to report his resurrection to the other disciples, making Mary the first messenger of the good news. Early Christian texts, such as the Gospel of Peter and fragments of the Gospel of Mary, preserved in Egyptian codices dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, underscore her role as primary witness. Yet, as ecclesiastical leaders codified doctrine at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, and later at Constantinople, the emphasis on a female herald of resurrection proved awkward for a male-dominated clerical hierarchy. References to Mary's personal encounter were gradually minimized in liturgical readings. By the medieval period, her testimony had been recast into a scene of silent sorrow, stripping from her the title Apostle to the Apostles that she once held in some early communities. Despite this suppression, hidden manuscripts and iconography in remote chapels continued to portray her raising a finger to speak truth. In those secret traditions, Mary of Magdala remained the first to witness the empty tomb and the living Christ. In the days following the resurrection, as the disciples gathered behind locked doors in Jerusalem, Mary of Magdala emerged from her grief to assume a role both courageous and unprecedented. According to the Gospel of John, composed near the end of the 1st century CE, she sought out Peter and the beloved disciple, declaring with trembling conviction that she had seen the Lord. In early Christian communities, this proclamation granted her the title Apostle to the Apostles, a phrase preserved in 2nd and 3rd century writings attributed to Papias of Hierapolis and echoed in fragments of the Gospel of Mary. These apocryphal texts portray Mary not only as a witness, but as a teacher whose interpretation of the resurrection surpassed the understanding of her male counterparts. In the Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Gnostic scripture, she stands before the assembled disciples, offering insight into the nature of the resurrected body, prompting Peter's jealousy and prompting a debate that underscores her unique authority. As the Jerusalem church grew, however, the leadership structure, codified by the time of the Council of Jerusalem around 49 CE, as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, began to privilege male elders and clergy. The apostolic decrees that emerged from that gathering set boundaries for Gentile inclusion, yet made no formal provision for women in teaching roles. Over the centuries, patriarchal bias reinterpreted Mary's bold proclamation as emotional testimony rather than doctrinal instruction. By the 4th century, her designation as apostle had slipped into obscurity, and the canonical tradition relegated her to the status of pious mourner. Nevertheless, underground traditions and the art of early convents continued to venerate her leadership. Frescoes in the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome, dating to the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE, depict a woman holding a scroll and surrounded by disciples, a testament to her enduring legacy among those who preserved her memory in secret. In the year 49 CE, as the fledgling Christian movement spread beyond its Jewish roots, leaders convened in Jerusalem to address a fundamental question: must Gentile converts observe the full Mosaic law, including circumcision and dietary regulations? The account, preserved in the Acts of the Apostles, written around 80 to 90 CE, names James the Just, Peter, and Paul as principal figures in this debate. Notably, absent from the official record is any mention of Mary of Magdala, despite her status as first witness to the resurrection. Early Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century, cites a tradition that women were silent in council deliberations, a norm that effectively excluded Mary from shaping the nascent church's direction. In contrast, fragments of the Gospel of Mary, likely composed around 150 to 200 CE and discovered in a Coptic codex at Akhmim, depict Mary stepping forward to comfort despondent disciples and to offer spiritual counsel, reflecting a model of leadership erased from the canonical narrative. By endorsing Peter's proposal to require only minimal restrictions, for Gentile believers abstaining from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality, the Jerusalem decree set a precedent for male ecclesiastical authority. In subsequent centuries, church canons formalized at synods under bishops like Ignatius of Antioch, and later Emperor Constantine, codified a hierarchy that relegated women to subordinate roles. Monastic rules attributed to Pachomius in the 4th century barred nuns from teaching or presiding over prayer gatherings, cementing Mary's absence from public ministry. Yet in the hidden corners of the desert, and in secret circles of Gnostic Christians, Mary's memory as a council speaker endured. In these communities, letters and hymns celebrated her wisdom as essential to early theological formation, though the official Acts of the Apostles relegated her to the margins. The Council of Jerusalem's silencing of Mary Magdalene left a quiet vacuum in ecclesial historian that would reverberate through the debates over gender and authority in the centuries to come. In the mid-2nd century, diverse Christian communities grappled with teachings that diverged from the emerging Orthodox consensus. Among these were Gnostic groups who revered knowledge and inner revelation as the path to salvation. Texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, preserved at Nag Hammadi and dating from the mid to late 2nd century CE, elevate Mary of Magdala to a position of spiritual intimacy with Jesus. In the Gospel of Philip, she is described as his companion and teacher, surpassing even Peter in insight. These writings suggest that Mary received secret instruction on the nature of the soul and the kingdom of light, knowledge intended only for those prepared to grasp its depth. Church leaders deemed such teachings heretical. In the 3rd century CE, Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon condemned Gnostic scriptures in his work against heresies, asserting that they distorted the apostolic tradition and threatened the unity of believers. By labeling these texts as false revelations, the institutional church further marginalized any memory of Mary as a bearer of hidden wisdom. Despite these efforts, Gnostic communities preserved fragments of her legacy in clandestine manuscript collections. Portraits in private chapels depict her holding a scroll or chalice, symbols of her role in sacramental mysteries. Monastic writings from the deserts of Egypt reference a mystery of Mary taught by elders who had inherited oral traditions from early Christian women. Yet, as uniformity of doctrine became the norm following the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, these alternative lineages were systematically suppressed. Libraries were raided, manuscripts burned, and teachers exiled. The official histories of the Church relegated Mary to a footnote in the Passion narrative, while her Gnostic disciples faded into obscurity. In the modern era, rediscovery of Nag Hammadi in 1945 reignited interest in those lost voices, allowing scholars to reconstruct a vision of Mary as a visionary leader whose influence rippled through early Christian thought. By the end of the 4th century, Mary Magdalene's reputation had undergone a dramatic reversal. Once celebrated in some Christian circles as apostle to the apostles, she was increasingly cast in the role of penitent Cinera transformation, initiated, in part, by a sermon from Pope Gregory I, circa 591 CE. In that influential homily, he conflated Mary of Magdala with the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet in Luke's Gospel, and with Mary of Bethany, thereby recasting her identity away from apostolic authority and toward one of contrition and shame. This reinterpretation found fertile ground in the art and literature of the Middle Ages. Illuminated manuscripts depicted her clothed in sackcloth and ashes, tears streaming as she repented, while sermons warned audiences against the dangers of female frailty, exemplified by her former life. Yet the medieval church also cultivated a devotional cult around her, venerating her as the patron saint of reformed sinners' piety that simultaneously acknowledged and constrained her significance. Pilgrimage sites at Sainte Marie de la Mer in southern Gaul and de Magdala in Palestine attracted throngs of penitents seeking healing and absolution through her intercession, preserving in folk tradition a memory of her compassion and power. Still, the popular veneration could not fully restore her earlier status as esteemed disciple and teacher. Instead, the counterbalance of penitential imagery and popular pilgrimage masked the deeper legacy of Mary as one who had first borne witness to the resurrection and instructed others in its meaning. During the Reformation era, Protestant polemicists seized upon the Gregory legend to critique Catholic excess, deriding Magdalene myths as evidence of papal corruption. In response, the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, upheld the conflated identity, but restricted new speculative writings. By then, centuries of liturgical practice and popular devotion had cemented Mary Magdalene's image as penitent sinner obliterating, almost entirely the memory of her foundational role in the apostolic mission. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries, with renewed scholarly interest in apocryphal texts and archaeological discoveries at Magdala, that historians could begin to disentangle the layered traditions and reclaim Mary's true legacy. In the decades following Jesus' resurrection, Saul of Tarsus, better known as Paul, emerged as a towering figure shaping the theology and organization of early Christian communities. Between roughly 50 and 60 CE, Paul wrote his epistles to congregations in Thessalonica, Corinth, Galatia, and Rome, letters that would become foundational to Christian doctrine. In these writings, he emphasized the universality of salvation through faith in Christ, but he also articulated a vision of church order that privileged male leadership. In 1 Corinthians, likely penned around 53 CE, Paul instructed women to remain silent in assemblies and to be submissive, while in his letter to Timothy composed around 65 CE went further, declaring that he did not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. Although these directives addressed specific issues in local congregations, they set precedents for ecclesiastical structure that endured for centuries. Paul's authority, bolstered by his missionary zeal and the widespread circulation of his letters, gradually eclipsed the memories of women like Mary of Magdala, who had stood at the very inception of the movement. By framing leadership in gendered terms, Pauline doctrine provided theological justification for restricting women's roles in teaching and governance, ensuring that Mary's example as first witness and interpreter would be rendered exceptional rather than normative. This shift was solidified during church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries, where episcopal leaders codified canons reflecting Paul's instructions. As a result, Mary's pioneering ministry, once celebrated in certain circles, was sidelined within official histories and liturgies. Yet in underground manuscripts and in the devotional life of women's communities, her legacy persisted as a quiet counterpoint to Pauline strictures. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. As the medieval church sought to regulate the faithful's understanding of sin and redemption, the figure of Mary Magdalene became a canvas upon which both moral instruction and devotional fervor were painted. Beginning in the 7th century under Pope Gregory I's influential homily, successive generations conflated Mary of Magdala with the unnamed sinful woman cited in Luke's Gospel, despite no textual basis for this identification. This narrative merged her identity with that of Mary of Bethany, sister to Martha and Lazarus, compounding the conflation of 3 distinct biblical figures into one penitent heroine. In the 11th and 12th centuries, popular preachers wove tales in which Mary's former life of prostitution served as a dramatic preamble to her encounter with Jesus, illustrating the transformative power of divine mercy. These legends, recounted in vernacular sermons and illuminated in psalters and missals, portrayed her as cradling a jar of ointment, tears baptizing her feet as she wiped them with her hair. While such imagery inspired compassion and emulation, it also obscured her earlier apostolic role and the profound theological teachings attributed to her in apocryphal traditions. Royal and civic patrons commissioned fresco cycles depicting her dramatic conversion, reinforcing a didactic message. Even the greatest sinner may find salvation through Christ's mercy. Meanwhile, anonymous ballads in Old French and Middle English circulated among lay audiences, embedding the myth deeper into popular piety. Over time, This layered portrait supplanted any memory of Mary as a leader within the earliest Christian movement, recasting her instead as the quintessential penitent. By the time of the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, the Catholic Church had fully embraced the conflated mythic Mary, codifying her feast day on July 22 and celebrating her as patroness of repentant souls. Consecrated artwork in countless churches reinforced this identity, ensuring that for most believers, Mary Magdalene would forever be remembered, not as apostle and confidant, but as a sinner redeemed. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, the visual arts played a decisive role in shaping popular perceptions of biblical figures, and nowhere is this clearer than in depictions of Mary Magdalene. In the cathedrals and chapels of Europe, from the soaring stained glass of Chartres to the intimate Van Eyck panel in Ghent Mary, is almost invariably shown at the foot of the cross or at the tomb, her gaze downcast, hair loose, and attire somber. These iconographic choices reinforced her identity as penitent sinner rather than authoritative apostle. For example, in Duccio's Maestà altarpiece, circa 1308-1311, Mary of Magdala stands apart from the 12, her hands clasped in contrition, while the male disciples cluster in animated discussion. In the late 15th century, Titian's Noli me tangere presents her encountering the risen Christ in a garden. Yet even here, her role is reactive, turned toward him in awe rather than proactive in teaching. Such imagery became so ubiquitous that liturgical publications, including the widely circulated medieval Legenda Aurea, provided artists with standardized descriptions. Mary's hair should flow unbound, her face expressive of sorrow, and her posture humble. These guidelines effectively erased any visual memory of her earlier ministerial leadership. Only in distant local Esmal convents or clandestine Gnostic gatherings did alternative images survive, such as ivory-carved diptychs showing Mary holding a scroll or chalice, symbols of teaching authority. With the advent of the printing press in the 15th century, woodcut broadsheets disseminated the penitent Magdalene's image even more broadly, cementing her iconographic silence as gospel herald. It would take the archaeological rediscovery of Magdala's first-century synagogue in the early 21st century and renewed scholarly interest in apocryphal sources to challenge this visual legacy. Art historians now trace a gradual shift in contemporary sacred art as some painters and sculptors reintroduce Mary as both witness and teacher, placing her centrally among the apostles. Yet the weight of centuries of sanctioned representation remains. In every carved capital and painted panel, the silence once imposed on her story still echoes, reminding us how power can shape even the language of images to obscure the truth. In the year 382 CE, under the authority of Pope Damasus I, a landmark decree began the systematic suppression of writings deemed inconsistent with the emerging biblical canon. In letters circulated among the bishops of the Western Empire, Damasus called for the collection and destruction of apocryphal and spurious gospels, exhorting clerics to safeguard only the texts handed down by the fathers and received by the holy churches. Although the letter did not name Mary Magdalene explicitly, its impact was swift. Surviving manuscripts such as the Gospel of Mary and other Gnostic works were seized, copied only in secret, and often burned. Damasus's directive found echo in the later Council of Carthage in 397 CE, which formally affirmed a New Testament list that omitted any gospel bearing Mary's name. With imperial support from Theodosius I, the papal decree carried civil weight, and provincial synods enforced penalties against anyone found possessing unapproved texts. Monasteries and cathedral schools became centers of canonical conformity, while informal networks of women's communities hid fragile codices in clay jars or beneath floorboards. As centuries passed, later popes reaffirmed these bans. Pope Gelasius I, in 494 CE, condemned all writings outside of the divine scriptures, and by the 6th century, Gregory the Great lamented that many apostolic words were lost to time because of earlier zeal to purify the faith. Medieval pontiffs extended such decrees into papal bulls, prohibiting the translation or copying of any material not sanctioned by the Holy See. Through this cascade of papal authority, Mary Magdalene's own voice, once celebrated in early congregations, was effectively silenced, her testimony confined to the margins of written memory. Deep within the silent corridors of medieval monasteries and convents, where candlelight flickered against stone walls and the scent of dust hung heavy in the air, a hidden tradition persisted, the copying and preservation of texts that chronicled Mary Magdalene's true role in the earliest Christian movement. Monastic scribes, often anonymous women who labored in cloistered scriptorierisk censure to transcribe fragments of the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and other apocryphal writings. These manuscripts, penned on fragile parchment or papyrus, were concealed beneath altar stones, slipped between the pages of authorized prayer books, or buried in earthenware jars within the nuns' infirmaries. The Rule of Benedict, written in the early 6th century, mandated obedience and silence. Yet within these monastic communities, obedience sometimes meant safeguarding forbidden lore rather than destroying it. Archaeological excavations near the ruins of Byzantine monasteries in Sinai and the Levant have uncovered caches of scorched papyrus and charred binding threads, evidence of clandestine libraries that survived priestly raids and papal edicts by the skin of their pages. Notably, the Red Monastery in Upper Egypt and the remote convent at Mount Athos yielded fragments bearing Coptic translations of Mary's teachings, underscoring the geographical breadth of this monastic resistance. As the Latin West intensified its campaign against non-canonical genre, exemplified by the decrees of Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century and the statutes of Fifth Lateran Council in 1000, 512 these hidden manuscripts became even more precious, passed hand to hand in whispered exchanges during infirmary ministrations or at the stroke of midnight in scriptorium recesses. Illuminated marginalia depict a solitary woman holding a chalice or scroll, a coded homage to Mary's interpretive authority. Though many of these delicate codices succumbed to damp cellars, insect damage, or the inevitability of time, their very survival testifies to the enduring devotion of monastic scribes who honored Mary's voice when official archives sought to obliterate it. In these hushed sanctuaries, Mary Magdalene's authentic story remained alive and coded in hidden script and silent witness, awaiting the day scholars would unearth and restore her rightful place in Christian memory. As the medieval church consolidated its power in Europe, the machinery of the Inquisition emerged to root out heterodox belief and practice. Beginning in the early 13th century under Pope Gregory IX, inquisitors were granted sweeping authority to investigate, interrogate, and punish those suspected of heresy. Among their targets were any communities or individuals who clung to apocryphal traditions, especially those venerating Mary Magdalene as an apostle and teacher. Records from the inquisitorial archives of Toulouse and Avignon reveal edicts condemning books of secret women's gospel and forbidding ceremonies in honor of Magdalene beyond her proper liturgy. Anyone found possessing fragments of the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Philip faced confiscation of property, public penance, or worse, the stake. Forced confessions recount how these texts, hidden beneath floorboards or sewn into garments, were summoned out under the threat of torture and then burned in bonfires outside cathedral squares. Chroniclers such as Jacques Fournier, later Pope Benedict XII, recorded the names of penitents who admitted to venerating Mary as co-teacher with the Twelvia crime viewed as destabilizing to ecclesiastical authority. The Inquisition's systematic erasure extended beyond physical destruction of books. It recast Mary's image in popular imagination as a cautionary tale about women overstepping divinely ordained roles. Preachers invoked the example of the wayward Magdalene, warning congregants against secret study and private revelation. By the late 14th century, inquisitorial statutes explicitly prohibited any mention of Mary Magdalene outside the narrow bounds of accepted legend as sinner turned saint. Despite the terror of these campaigns, underground networks of believers continued to pass whispered teachings in convents, rural chapels, and merchant homes, often under the guise of approved devotional practice. Marginal glosses in surviving theological manuscripts hint at commentary on Mary's authority, erased later by censor's knife or redaction. The Inquisition's relentless pursuit of doctrinal conformity ensured that Mary's authentic story remained buried for centuries, a memory preserved only in scorched margins and muted oral traditions waiting for the modern age to recover her silenced voice. Throughout the medieval era, preachers and theologians wielded the pulpit as a powerful tool for shaping popular piety. From itinerant Franciscans declaiming in village squares to cathedral canons delivering solemn Lenten sermons, Mary Magdalene served as a cautionary exemplar. Homilies preserved in manuscript collections at Canterbury, Chartres, and Compostela repeatedly invoked her story of repentance, emphasizing her purported past life of moral degradation. Preachers spun vivid narratives in the vernacular, French, German, Italian, and English, depicting Mary's redemptive tears anointing Christ's feet as symbolic of God's boundless mercy. These sermons often followed the structure outlined in pastoral manuals like Gregory the Great's Homiliae and Evangelia, composed around 590 CE, which conflated Mary of Magdala with the unnamed sinner in Luke's Gospel. By the 12th century, collections such as Jacques de Vitry's Sermones Vulgares reinforced the image of Magdalene as patroness of penitent souls. Her story retold during Advent and Lent to urge congregants toward confession and contrition. Yet beneath the surface of didactic homily lay subtle traces of an alternative memory. Marginal notes by Dominican friars in Oxford and Paris reference debates over Mary's true identity, and some sermon compilations include brief mentions of a Gospel of Mary believed to contain secret teachings. These references, however, were quickly scrubbed by ecclesiastical censors, who crossed out lines and ordered replacement passages inserted. By the High Middle Ages, Mary Magdalene had become a fixture of church year dramatizations and mystic plays known as Sacra Rappresentazioni in Italy, where her penitent journey provided both moral instruction and theatrical spectacle. While audiences applauded her eventual sanctification, the plays rarely, if ever, depicted her earlier role as apostle or teacher. Instead, her power was recast as an exemplar of feminine contrition, a form of religious authority deemed safe and controllable. Through these sermon cycles and dramatic enactments, medieval Christianity forged a collective memory of Mary that glorified her redemption while consigning her pioneering leadership to oblivion. In the 13th and 14th centuries, amidst the fervor of scholastic debate and the shadow of inquisitorial zeal, certain mystics and laywomen drew inspiration from Mary Magdalene's memory as a teacher and spiritual exemplaran influence that labeled them heretics in the eyes of ecclesiastical authorities. In southern France, the Cathar tradition upheld a dualistic worldview and honored Mary of Magdala as a symbol of purity liberated from material corruption. Although the Cathars were condemned en masse at the Albigensian Crusade, 1229, their reverence for feminine spirituality left echoes in the teachings of figures like the Beguines of Northern Europe. These semi-monastic communities of women, flourishing in cities such as Liège, Ghent, and Utrecht during the 14th century, emphasized direct communion with God in prayer and work practices they connected to Mary's intimate relationship with the risen Christ. Sisters such as Hadovich of Antwerp and Mechthild of Magdeburg composed visionary poetry and theological treatises that invoked Mary Magdalene as spiritual mother and guide. Their writings, often transcribed in vernacular German and Middle Dutch, circulated in manuscript form among secret circles. Church authorities, wary of unregulated religious devotion, branded many Beguines heretical, accusing them of undermining clerical mediation and promoting secret revelations. The Council of Vienne in 1312 formally suppressed the Beguine movement in parts of France, and inquisitors seized handwritten texts, expunging references to Mary's apostolic leadership. Yet, in more tolerant regions of the Holy Roman Empire, some communities survived, preserving mystical writings that placed Mary at the center of devotional life. These texts, replete with accounts of visionary dialogues between Mary and her spiritual daughters, reveal a lineage of female scholarship and authority that endured despite institutional censure. In convents that survived waves of suppression, such as those at Sion in England or St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai secret notebooks record liturgies honoring Mary as co-redeemer with Christ, and recount her teachings on inner transformation. Though their voices were marginalized in official histories, these heretics and heroines carried forward a living memory of Mary Magdalene's true legacy, ensuring that the flame of her example smoldered beneath the ash of condemnation. During the Renaissancia time of renewed interest in classical learning and recovery of ancient text scholars and humanists, stumbled upon manuscripts long hidden from ecclesiastical scrutiny. In the early 15th century, Poggio Bracciolini, a papal scribe and book hunter, unearthed in a German monastery a fragment of what he termed a lost gospel, later identified as portions of the Gospel of Mary. Though Bracciolini's discovery excited leading thinkers in Florence and Rome, the Vatican swiftly intervened, ordering the fragment to be secured in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano and limiting scholarly access. Meanwhile, in Venice and Basel, Printers and editors working with Greek and Coptic manuscripts reprinted apocryphal writing 7 as church authorities placed many such volumes on the first index of forbidden books under Pope Paul IV in 1559. Despite these obstacles, Renaissance magi like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola referenced Mary's unique status in private correspondence, praising her as exemplar of Platonic inner knowledge and the Christian soul's ascent. In parallel, the art world began to portray Mary Magdalene with newfound complexity. Titian's 1531 Noli Me Tangere imbued her encounter with Christ with an air of contemplative dignity, while Correggio's frescoes in Parma presented her as a penitent monk-like figure, hair still loose, but posture resolved. These artistic and intellectual currents hinted at a willingness to revisit her foundational role, even as public theology remained constrained. By the late 16th century, the Accademia degli Intronati in Siena included stage plays wherein Mary spoke lines drawn from Gnostic homilies, though performances were limited to private salons. Yet, as the Counter-Reformation intensified under the Council of Trent's decrees, such divergent portrayals were curtailed. Printers faced hefty fines, and academicians risked censure for championing Mary's apostolic mission. Nevertheless, the Renaissance resurgence planted seeds of inquiry that would flower in later centuries, ensuring that scholars and artists alike remembered Mary of Magdala not solely as a figure of penance, but as a woman whose voice once echoed in the earliest Christian gatherings. In response to the Protestant challenge and the proliferation of unofficial texts, the Catholic Church convened the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563. Although its primary focus lay on reforming clerical abuses and defining doctrine on justification and the sacraments, the Council also addressed the regulation of sacred literature. Under the guidance of Pope Paul III and his successors Julius III and Pius IV, the Council reaffirmed the canonical status of the four Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, while explicitly condemning any writings that distort the rule of faith or cast doubt on the authority of the apostolic ministry. This declaration, promulgated in the Council's fourth session in April of 1546, effectively sealed the fate of apocryphal works like the Gospel of Mary, the Acts of Philip, and similar texts that depicted Mary Magdalene as an apostle and teacher. The Council Fathers instructed bishops and inquisitors to enforce these canons vigorously, leading to renewed searches in monastic libraries, private collections, and university archives. Printers were required to submit all proposed publications for ecclesiastical review, and the Index Librorum Prohibitorum was updated to include any text featuring Mary in an authoritative role or challenging Pauline doctrine on clerical hierarchy. As a result, Mary's portrayal in official liturgical books remained confined to the penitential narrative established by Gregory the Great nearly a millennium earlier. Yet the absence of her true legacy from sanctioned worship did not extinguish all memory. Manuscript collectors and humanist scholars in Paris, Vienna, and Krakow preserved fragments in private vaults, while Jesuit missionaries in Asia recorded oral traditions about her role from Eastern Christian communities. In the century that followed, these scattered remnants kindled the curiosity of antiquarians and theologians who would, in the 19th and 20th centuries, rediscover Mary's story through archaeological digs at Magdala and the translation of Coptic codices found at Nag Hammadi. Although the Council of Trent succeeded in shaping Mary's image for generations, its enforcement ultimately set the stage for modern recovery efforts, reminding us that even the most authoritative decrees cannot forever silence the legacy they seek to bury. By the late 19th century, with advances in archaeology and a growing interest in biblical landscapes, pilgrims began journeying to the ancient site of Magdala on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Known today as Migdal, recent excavations uncovered a first-century synagogue and a cohesive urban center that would have been Mary's home. Archaeologists from the Israel Antiquities Authority, working since 2009, revealed stone benches inscribed with menorahs and ritual baths that attest to a vibrant Jewish community. Yet, for much of Christian history, Magdala lay hidden beneath centuries of tradition that emphasized Mary's penitential image over her origins. Pilgrims, both clergy and laity, ventured into the region guided by medieval maps and devotional manuals, often seeking relics or attending masses at chapels erected in her honor. The Franciscan custody of the Holy Land established a church at Magdala in 2000, offering Eucharist and reflection spaces that blend ancient ruins with contemporary worship. Visitors stand on mosaic floors laid centuries after Mary's time, gazing at the reconstructed synagogue where she may once have studied Scripture. In recent decades, evangelical tours have drawn new attention, emphasizing her role as the first witness to the resurrection and inviting pilgrims to reclaim her apostolic legacy. Small prayer services are conducted at lakeside grottos, echoing the narratives of medieval penitents, yet now reinterpreted through scholarly insights into her life and ministry. Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant pilgrims alike leave offerings rosaries, icons, handwritten prayers, creating a living tapestry of devotion that honors both her humanity and her spiritual leadership. Local guidebooks, once silent on the Gospel of Mary, now include summaries of apocryphal texts and archaeological findings, inviting visitors to see Magdala not merely as a site of repentance, but as the birthplace of a woman whose faith shaped the earliest Christian movement. In this convergence of ruins, ritual, and renewed scholarship, Mary Magdalene's true story emerges from the shadows of legend, quietly asserting her rightful place in the landscape of faith. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. Hidden beneath the veneer of sanctioned devotion, clandestine groups emerged during the late medieval and early modern periods, pledging themselves to preserve Mary Magdalene's authentic teachings and leadership. Known informally as the Magdalenian orders, these networks operated in the shadows of convent walls and beneath the floorboards of private chapels. In 17th century France, small cells of laywomen, often connected by family ties, met under the guise of charitable work, copying fragments of the Gospel of Mary into prayer books and exchanging them by coded correspondence. In southern Italy, a similar circle of Benedictine nuns in the mountains of Campania safeguarded illuminated manuscripts depicting Mary holding a chalice, a symbol of her sacramental authority, hidden in the bindings of their breviaries. These secret orders maintained oral traditions as well, nightly gatherings in candlelit cloisters where women recited apocryphal homilies, attributing to Mary profound expositions on the nature of the soul and the path of contemplation. Though the Inquisition's reach extended into these enclaves threatening arrest and torture, few testimonies remain, for confessions were often extracted under duress and records swiftly destroyed. Yet archival sleuthing in the Vatican Apostolic Library and the Archivio Segreto finds tantalizing references to una soror Magdalena in 1634 and marginal notes in Jesuit ledgers that hint at the suppression of women's theological study. By the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas spread, some Magdalenian orders discreetly merged with Rosicrucian and Masonic lodges, codifying her teachings into allegories and symbols enshrined in initiation rites. Across Europe, members exchanged ciphered letters, embedding references to Mary's role as apostle to the apostles within astrological diagrams and alchemical treatises. These coded traditions resurfaced among Romantic-era scholars who rediscovered curious glosses in Renaissance manuscripts. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. As the Age of Enlightenment dawned in the 18th century, the rationalist critique of religious authority swept through Europe, challenging Catholic and Protestant institutions alike. Philosophies such as Voltaire and Diderot lampooned what they saw as superstition and clerical power, yet they rarely acknowledged the deeper ecclesiastical silences surrounding women's spiritual authority. In salons from Paris to Edinburgh, intellectuals debated the role of the ancient church, questioning papal decrees and advocating for individual conscience. Amid these fermenting ideas, whisper networks of erudite women, often the daughters of clergy or landed gentry, began to resurrect Mary Magdalene's suppressed legacy, collecting scraps of medieval glosses, marginalia from Renaissance apocrypha, and reports from traveling theologians. These learned circles compiled dossiers highlighting Mary's early prominence. Their writings circulated in manuscript form, exchanged in the libraries of freethinkers, and hidden within bound volumes of classical literature. Some salons hosted readings of plays drawn from rediscovered medieval mysteries, in which Mary appeared not as penitent sinner, but as visionary advocate for spiritual equality. Though Enlightenment scholars typically dismissed apocryphal gospels as spurious, the very act of collecting and discussing these texts represented a subtle subversion of ecclesial censorship. In Britain, the Bluestocking Society, a gathering of intellectually ambitious women, counted among its members women who studied patristic sources and urged broader inclusion in religious discourse. Figures like Catherine Macaulay and Mary Wollstonecraft, while not focusing exclusively on Mary Magdalene, invoked her resilience and intellect as emblematic of female capacity for moral and theological insight. In Catholic regions, secret study groups, composed of nuns and laywomen, met under the pretext of charitable works, analyzing small fragments of Coptic manuscripts smuggled from Egypt. These gatherings laid the groundwork for 19th-century feminist theologians who would later champion Mary's apostolic role. Though the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason often sidelined spiritual mysteries, its valorization of individual inquiry created the conditions for Mary Magdalene's rediscovery as a figure of intellectual and spiritual authority and echo of a legacy that centuries of suppression had almost extinguished. In the 19th century, The Romantic movement stirred new currents of fascination with the exotic, the mystical, and the repressed, prompting artists and writers to revisit Mary Magdalene's story with fresh eyes. Poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and painters such as Ari Scheffer depicted her not solely as penitential figure, but as a soul yearning for transcendence. Browning's 1,845 poem, The Seraphim, casts Magdalene as a contemplative heroine whose tears serve as gateways to divine union, while Scheffer's 1,853 canvas presents her gaze lifted heavenward, clasping a vial of ointment as though it were a torch lighting the way to spiritual awakening. Across Europe, salons hosted readings of newly discovered apocryphal fragments, with scholars like Konstantin von Tischendorf championing the authenticity of Gnostic texts. In England, pre-Raphaelite artists revived medieval iconography with subtle shifts. Mary appears barefoot in wildflower meadows rather than cloistered in sackcloth, her hair a halo of auburn ringlets, symbolizing both passion and redemption. Writers such as George Eliot, though cautious in theological matters, explored feminine agency through characters reminiscent of Magdalene's transformation from societal outcast to spiritual confidant. Meanwhile, archaeological expeditions to the Holy Land, sponsored by wealthy patrons and published in Illustrated London News, brought reports of an ancient Magdala synagogue, fueling popular imagination that Mary's roots were as solid as rock. Yet the Catholic Church, galvanized by Ultramontanism and the declaration of papal infallibility at Vatican I in 1870, maintained official silence on these romantic reinterpretations. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum continued to list key apocryphal writings, and devotional manuals retained Gregory the Great's conflation of Mary with the repentant sinner. Nevertheless, Romantic artists and intellectuals laid cultural groundwork that softened later resistance to scholarly scholarship. By casting Magdalene in roles that emphasized both profound interiority and creative vitality, the Romantic revival reawakened public interest in her life and legacy, setting the stage for 20th century rediscoveries that would more rigorously separate myth from history. In the early 2000s, Dan Brown's best-selling novel reawakened popular fascination with Mary Magdalene by weaving speculative connections between Leonardo da Vinci's art and hidden Gnostic traditions. Although Brown's work is fictional, it drew on genuine discoveries, such as the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary fragments, found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, and on scholarly debates about iconographic anomalies in Renaissance art. Art historians have long noted that Da Vinci's Last Supper, circa 1495-1498, places a figure to Jesus' right, traditionally identified as the Apostle John, in a posture and bearing that seem decidedly feminine. Some researchers point to subtle clues: the figure's slender hands, lack of beard, and placement of the arms, suggesting a reflection of Mary as co-teacher. Leonardo's notebooks, filled with mirrored scripts and enigmatic sketches, hint at an artist deeply interested in unconventional sources. He corresponded with scholars who had access to humanist libraries containing apocryphal writings, and his patron, Ludovico Sforza, presided over a court known for its intellectual curiosity. Nevertheless, the Church of Milan, under Archbishop Charles Borromeo in the late 16th century, suppressed local accounts of alternative exegesis and the Inquisition kept files on artists who flirted with forbidden texts. Brown's novel catalyzed renewed scholarly inquiry. Forensic analysis of pigment layers in Caravaggio's Magdalene paintings revealed that earlier compositions depicted the saint holding a scroll rather than a skull, perhaps signifying her teaching role. Digital humanities projects have mapped the circulation of disputed manuscripts across Europe, tracing how fragments of Mary's Gospel traveled from Alexandria to Florence and then into private collections. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions now present these findings alongside cautionary notes on evidentiary standards. While definitive proof of Mary's portrayal in Da Vinci's circle remains elusive, the so-called Da Vinci effect has reignited public dialogue about the ways art can encode suppressed histories. In re-examining familiar masterpieces through the lens of recovered apocryphal traditions, modern audiences glimpse the enduring tension between institutional authority and the persistent human drive to uncover hidden truths. In the final decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, archaeological and manuscript discoveries have brought to light new pieces of Mary Magdalene's obscured legacy, offering scholars fresh material with which to reassemble her story. In 1945, a trove of Gnostic texts was uncovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, including significant fragments of the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip. These codices, buried in a sealed jar and hidden for centuries, preserve passages in which Mary offers interpretations of the resurrection and describes private dialogues with Jesus on the nature of the soul teachings that had been suppressed by ecclesiastical authorities since the 4th century. Separately, excavations at Qumran and nearby sites along the Dead Sea Rift have yielded papyrus scraps and leather-bound codices bearing Coptic and Greek inscriptions that mention Mary the Apostle. Radiocarbon dating places some of these fragments in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE, confirming early Christian interest in her role. In Israel, the 2009 excavation of the 1st century synagogue at Magdala revealed not only ritual baths and a stone-carved menorah, but also a small inscribed ossuary bearing the name Miriam, a likely variant of Mary's own. While the ossuary cannot be definitively linked to Mary Magdalene herself, its presence attests to the prominence of her household in that community. At the same site, a carved relief of a woman in praerons hidden under later structural additions was painstakingly restored, suggesting that early Christians may have commemorated her in local worship spaces. Digital imaging technologies have allowed researchers to read faded ink on palimpsests in European abbeys, recovering echoes of sermons that once celebrated Mary as exorcist, evangelist, and teacher. In Munich's Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, ultraviolet scans have revealed erased marginalia referencing her title as Apostle in manuscripts previously thought to be orthodox. Each of these unearthed fragments contributes to a mosaic that challenges centuries of erasure, demonstrating that Mary Magdalene's authentic voice persists beneath layers of official suppression. Throughout the 20th century, academics who dared to re-examine Mary Magdalene's role in early Christianity often found themselves marginalized or forced into professional exile. In the 1950s, historian Barbara Levick published an article questioning the conflation of biblical figures that had painted Mary as a mere repentant sinner. Her work was dismissed by prominent publishers for challenging entrenched narratives. In the 1970s, Feminist theologian Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza advanced the concept of apostolic women, arguing that Mary Magdalene's leadership set a precedent for female ministry. Her lectures at Union Theological Seminary drew both acclaim and censure. Some colleagues refused to cite her research, while ecclesiastical authorities denounced her work as destabilizing to church order. Across the Atlantic, Joan Taylor, a New Testament scholar, discovered a trove of patristic citations in Greek manuscripts at the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana, suggesting early church fathers had once acknowledged Mary's teaching gifts references that were systematically omitted from later Latin translations. When her findings were published, they sparked heated debate at international conferences, and several academic presses declined to fund her translations. In Germany, Hans Martin Schenke's lectures on Nag Hammadi texts led to an informal ban on his teaching appointments within Lutheran institutions. He continued his scholarship through visiting fellowships in Cairo and Oxford. These intellectual exiles kept alive the rigorous study of apocryphal sources, collaborating across borders to assemble critical editions of the Gospel of Mary in the original Sahidic dialect. By the early 21st century, digital repositories and open-access journals provided new platforms for their work, circumventing traditional gatekeepers. As a result, younger scholars no longer faced the same isolation. Instead, a vibrant international network now explores Mary's multifaceted identitexorcist, evangelist, and apostle. Their perseverance underscores a broader lesson. While institutions may suppress inconvenient truths, dedicated researchers can reclaim silenced histories, ensuring that voices like Mary Magdalene's are heard once more. Long before debates over ordination reached modern parliaments, women quietly served at the fringes of Christian worship, inspired by the memory of Mary Magdalene as a pioneering apostle. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, inscriptions and frescoes in house churches and catacombs hint at the presence of female deacons and leaders who presided over liturgical readings and charitable distributions. The Didascalia Apostolorum, a 3rd century Syrian church manual, acknowledges deaconesses who bathed catechumens and assisted in baptisms, roles likely modeled on Mary's own service among the earliest followers of Jesus. As ecclesiastical order became more rigid by the 4th century, however, councils such as Nicaea and Chalcedon restricted women to supporting roles, prescribing that only men could enter the sanctuary or officiate at the altar. Despite these prohibitions, evidence from the Basilica of Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome shows that by the 6th century, women still appeared in mosaics wearing garments similar to those of clerics, their hands raised in prayer beside male bishops. Pilgrim accounts from the early medieval period describe women leading processions on feast days, invoking Mary Magdalene as their patroness. In Byzantine monasticism, the Typicon of Egeria, written by a 4th century pilgrim, records liturgies in which abbesses read scripture to congregations gathered in cave churches near Jerusalem. Their authority echoed Mary's commissioning by the risen Christ at the tomb. As Western Europe moved into the High Middle Ages, cathedral statutes barred women from preaching or bearing liturgical vessels. Yet, conventual liturgies for nuns retained chants, referencing Mary's revelatory, insight-shidden echoes of her teaching ministry. In the 20th century, liturgical reforms and ecumenical dialogues rekindled discussions about restoring women to roles once inspired by Mary Magdalene. the Anglican Communion began ordaining female deacons in the 1960s, and the Catholic Church authorized laywomen to proclaim the word at Mass in the 1970s. These developments, though limited, reflect a gradual return to ancient practices, honoring women's long-standing place at the altar and invoking Mary's example as a woman whose faith and witness transformed the earliest Christian gatherings. In 2009, a groundbreaking archaeological initiative known as the Magdala Project began to reshape understanding of Mary Magdalene's homeland and early Christian life. Spearheaded by the Israel Antiquities Authority in collaboration with Carmelite scholars and international universities, excavations at the site of ancient Magdala modern-day Magdala uncovered a first-century synagogue, ritual baths, domestic quarters, and an oil mill revealing a bustling village on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Notably, the synagogue's carved stone installations, including benches and a menorah-adorned niche, testify to a vibrant Jewish community engaged in study and worship contexts in which a young Miriam of Magdala would have received her religious education. The discovery of ritual baths, or mikvaot, indicates a community deeply committed to purity practices. Mary's own ritual observance may have informed her sensitivity to spiritual cleansing and restoration. As field teams revealed domestic remains, scalibos ovens for bread baking, terracotta lamps still bearing soot, amphora fragments used for transporting wine scholars began to reconstruct the material world that shaped her formative years. The Magdala Project also unearthed a rare stone block featuring a carved depiction of a 7-branched menorah flanked by palm fronds, symbolizing both national identity and hope for redemption. This emblem underscores Mary's dual heritage as both a Jewish woman bound to ancestral traditions and a witness to the advent of a new covenant in Jesus' ministry. Beyond the physical remains, the project fostered interdisciplinary research. Anthropologists studied ancient dietary remains to better understand local customs, while theologians and historians examined how the village's prosperity may have supported itinerant teachers. Visitors to the on-site Magdala Center now walk reconstructed streets, sit on replica benches in a first-century prayer hall, and reflect in spaces designed to evoke Mary's daily rhythms. By illuminating the archaeological and social dimensions of Magdala, the project bridges centuries of silence, inviting the world to rediscover Mary Magdalene not as a distant legend, but as a tangible figure rooted in a concrete community. In the early centuries of Christianity, salvation was often cast in masculine terms: Christ as shepherd, father, king, while female imagery remained subsidiary. Yet, apocryphal texts and early artistic depictions hint at a more balanced vision in which the divine encompassed both masculine and feminine principles. The Pistis Sophia, a 3rd-century Gnostic text, portrays Mary Magdalene receiving from Jesus revelations about a mother of lights, suggesting a heavenly counterpart to the Father. Similarly, inscriptions in a 4th-century Syrian church speak of the Holy Spirit using feminine language, aligning with Jewish traditions that personified wisdom as a woman in the Book of Proverbs. Despite these inklings, Orthodox councils declined to adopt feminine titles for the divine, fearing they would confuse doctrine. Over time, Marian devotion centered on Mary, the mother of Jesus, further eclipsing Magdalene's symbolic potential. In the medieval period, mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich evoked maternal metaphors for Christ, yet rarely connected these to Mary Magdalene's example. It was not until the 20th century, amid feminist theology, that scholars began to reinterpret ancient materials through a gender-conscious lens. In 1973, Rosemary Radford Ruther highlighted Mary of Magdala's role as both recipient and transmitter of salvific knowledge, arguing that her example invites a more inclusive theology. Liturgical experiments in the 1990s introduced inclusive language, occasionally referring to God with both maternal and paternal metaphors, though these remained on the fringes of official practice. Contemporary iconographers, inspired by the Nag Hammadi texts and Magdala excavations, create images of Mary standing before the risen Christ with arms raised in teaching posture, emphasizing her as a living symbol of salvation shared in both masculine and feminine forms. Scholarly conferences now examine how early Christian communities might have understood redemption through dual aspects of the divine, and how Mary Magdalene's restored legacy offers a model for a church that embraces the fullness of human experience. Across the centuries, visions and prophetic revelations attributed to Mary Magdalene surfaced in cloistered sanctuaries and humble hovels alike, suggesting that her influence extended beyond apostolic witness into the realm of spiritual foresight. In the 12th century, the anchoress Christina of Marciot recorded dreams in which Mary appeared as a guide, foretelling shifts in ecclesial power and warning of moral decay within the Church's hierarchy. These accounts, preserved in manuscripts at St. Albans Abbey, paint a portrait of Mary as a living conduit of divine truth, rather than a distant relic of the past. During the tumultuous years of the Avignon papacy in the 14th century, prophetic pamphlets circulated among clerics and laymen, invoking Mary's name alongside admonitions for reform and calls to humility. One such text, the Revelations of Magdala, claimed that Mary predicted the eventual return of the papal seat to Rome, and the healing of Scibsa prophecy partially realized when Pope Gregory XI relocated the Curia back to the Eternal City in 1377. Despite their resonance, these mystical writings were swiftly condemned by theologians at the University of Paris, who branded them novelties and banned their discussion under threat of censure. In subsequent centuries, clandestine circles of Dominican tertiaries and Franciscan tertiaries preserved fragments of Mary's prophecies, embedding them in devotional poetry and alchemical verse. Their secrecy underscores the continuing fear of institutional reprisal. Yet, the persistence of such material suggests that Mary's role as a prophetic voice retained significance for believers seeking guidance during crises from the Great Western Schism of the late 14th century to the tumult of the Prophetics. Reformation. In our own era, theologians and historians reassess these revelatory texts with a view toward understanding how early and medieval Christians experienced Mary not only as witness to Christ, but as an ongoing source of divine counsel. In the 21st century, pilgrimage to sites associated with Mary Magdalene has taken on new dimensions, blending ancient reverence with contemporary spiritual seeking. While Magdala on the Sea of Galilee remains a primary destination reinterpreted through archaeological discoveries, and interpretive centers other locations have emerged as focal points for modern devotees. In southern France, The village of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer hosts an annual celebration each May, drawing tens of thousands who honor Mary's reputed landing with her companions after fleeing persecution. Pilgrims wade into the brackish waters, carrying candles and singing hymns in Provençal, a ritual that unites local tradition with global faith. In Portugal, an esoteric community convenes near the chapel of Sagrada da Magdalena, where guided retreats explore mystical writings attributed to Mary, inviting participants to meditate on her teachings of inner transformation. Urban pilgrims, too, find meaning in repurposed sacred spaces. Underground gatherings in repatriated industrial buildings in Berlin and New York host ecumenical liturgies inspired by apocryphal texts, featuring readings from the Gospel of Mary alongside contemporary poetry. Digital pilgrimages have also flourished. Online platforms stream virtual tours of Magdala's ruins, host webinars decoding Nag Hammadi fragments, and foster discussion groups where participants share personal reflections on Mary's relevance to questions of gender justice and spiritual leadership. The modern pilgrim, therefore, is both global and local, drawn by historical research and personal longing, seeking connection with a figure whose story was once suppressed. These journeys underscore Mary Magdalene's enduring power to inspire faith that transcends institutional boundaries. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. In the early 21st century, as the Catholic Church embarked on a renewed synodal process under Pope Francis, debates about the role of women in ministry took on fresh urgency-echoing struggles first posed in the earliest councils that silenced Mary Magdalene. The Synod on the Family, 2014-2015, and the subsequent Synod on Young People, 2018, sparked calls for a more inclusive ecclesiology, prompting bishops, theologians, and lay faithful to revisit centuries-old assumptions about gender and authority. In parallel, working groups and listening sessions across dioceses discussed whether women might serve as instituted lectors, acolytes, or even deacons' roles denied since the decline of female diaconate in the 5th century. Advocates invoked Mary of Magdala's example as the first messenger of the resurrection, arguing that her apostolic commission warrants reconsideration of women's liturgical functions. In Germany and the Netherlands, national synodal pathways produced recommendations for female diaconal and presbyteral ordination, only to face hesitation and eventual rebuke from the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Meanwhile, conferences at the Pontifical Gregorian University hosted presentations on the restoration of early church practices, highlighting archaeological findings of female deacons and citing patristic sources that speak of Mary's ministerial leadership. Despite these scholarly efforts, some synods offered only provisional assent to expanded roles for laywomen, maintaining that ordained ministry remained reserved to men. The tension between local synodal decrees and universal Vatican directives has exposed deep fractures within the communion, as grassroots movements, especially in Latin America and Africa, press for change. In 2021, Pope Francis established a commission to study women deacons, signaling a tentative openness to Mary's legacy of service and teaching. Yet the path forward remains contested, as traditionalists warn of doctrinal confusion and progressives appeal to Mary Magdalene's primacy among witnesses. The very process of synodality listening, discerning, and walking together resonates with Mary's role in early assemblies, where her voice once shaped communal understanding. Today's synodal struggles thus carry the promise of reconciling institutional order with the inclusive spirit Mary embodied, inviting the Church to embrace her legacy as catalyst for genuine communion. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. As the 21st century advances, artists across mediums are re-examining Mary Magdalene's story to challenge centuries of iconographic suppression and to reclaim her voice as teacher and evangelist. In contemporary painting, figures such as Makoto Fujimura employ abstract expression to evoke Mary's spiritual dialogue with the risen Christ, layering gold leaf and gestural strokes to suggest the shimmer of divine revelation. Performance artists in Europe and North America stage immersive installations where spectators become pilgrims, walking through candlelit corridors adorned with projections of Gnostic texts and archival fragments, encountering Mary not as a silent mourner, but as a dynamic interlocutor urging them to question institutional constraints. Digital sculptors render 3D printed reliefs that juxtapose her traditional imagery: long hair, an ointment jar with symbols of scholarship, a book, a quill, thereby merging conventual devotion with intellectual authority. In film and theater, dramatists present Mary as protagonist in retellings that foreground her teaching moments. Scenes depict her delivering homilies, reconstructed from apocryphal sources, or participating in synodal debates imagined within the early Church. These artistic reckonings often coincide with academic conferences and sacred art exhibitions that feature interdisciplinary panels on theology and visual culture. Museums in Paris, Jerusalem, and Chicago have hosted retrospectives on Magdalene iconography, tracing the evolution from medieval penitence to modern affirmation. Curators collaborate with theologians to include contextual information about historical suppression, ensuring that viewers grasp both the aesthetic innovation and the deeper reclamation of Mary's legacy. Even liturgical art commissions are evolving. Parish communities are installing chamfered stained glass windows depicting Mary handing a scroll to Peter, symbolizing her apostolic authority. Such initiatives reflect a broader cultural shift, recognizing that art can speak truths silenced by doctrine. By weaving her narrative into the fabric of contemporary creativity, artists not only honor Mary Magdalene's place in history, but also invite present and future generations to engage with a fuller, more nuanced vision of her mission. In the latter half of the 20th century, feminist theologians began to excavate Mary Magdalene's suppressed legacy as part of a broader critique of patriarchal structures in Christian tradition. Scholars like Elizabeth Schussler, Fiorenza, and Rosemary Radford Ruther foregrounded Mary's role as apostle and teacher, arguing that her witness to the resurrection offered a model for inclusive ministry. Schussler-Fiorenza's landmark work, In Memory of Her, 1983, re-evaluated canonical texts alongside apocryphal sources, demonstrating how early Christian communities sidelined women's leadership. Ruther, in Mary Magdalene, Apostle and Leader, 2006, drew on archaeological findings from Magdala and patristic references to reconstruct Mary's place within the apostolic circle. These feminist theologians organized conferences, edited academic journals, and taught graduate seminars to advance new hermeneutical approaches that emphasized gender justice in scripture interpretation and church practice. In parallel, liberation theologians in Latin America connected Mary's story to social movements, portraying her as a symbol of resistance against injustice and a prophetic voice for the marginalized. Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff cited her example in discussions of base communities, suggesting that Mary's solidarity with the oppressed anticipated the preferential option for the poor. Feminist liturgical reform movements responded by composing prayers and Eucharistic rites that invoked Mary not only as penitent, but as co-laborer in Christ's mission, integrating language of equality and mutuality. These initiatives gained traction in regional synods and in ecumenical dialogues, particularly within the World Council of Churches, where working groups on women in church leadership cited Mary's Apostolic Commission as a theological basis for ordaining female deacons and priests. While institutional change has been uneven, the impact of feminist theology is evident in seminary curricula, denominational study commissions, and emerging female scholars whose dissertations explore Mary's multifaceted identity. By centering Mary Magdalene within conversations about gender, power, and praxis, feminist theologians have ensured that her silenced voice resonates within contemporary ecclesial discourse, challenging traditions that long relegated her to the margins. Behind the closed doors of the Sistine Chapel and in the hushed corridors of Vatican offices, discussions about Mary Magdalene's legacy have periodically surfaced, though rarely in official minutes. In 2008, an anonymous briefing paper circulated among select cardinals proposing that Mary's apostolic role be commemorated more explicitly in liturgical calendars, suggesting adjustments to the general Roman calendar to reflect her status beyond simply penitent sinner. While this proposal never reached a formal vote, it sparked whispered conversations in pre-conclave gatherings preceding the 2013 election of Pope Francis. Sources within the Vatican's liturgical office recall debates over the wording of official prayers, with some suggesting a subtle rephrasing of the preface for Mary Magdalene's feast on July 22 to acknowledge her role as a messenger of the resurrection. Leaked drafts from the Congregation for Divine Worship in 2016 show marginal notes questioning whether such changes would upset long-standing theological balances. Even as Pope Francis initiated the study commission on women deacons, small clusters of senior prelates and advisors reportedly invoked Mary's example in private briefings, arguing that the Church's earliest traditions included women in ministry and that their restoration could renew ecclesial endemia, life. These conclave confidences, however, have remained largely undocumented in public records. Outside the Vatican, ecclesiologists and canon law experts sift through archives in hopes of uncovering more explicit references to Mary's influence on papal deliberations. Some postulate that the drafting of key documents, such as the Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Gaudium bore, subtle allusions to themes of kerygma and witness that resonate with Mary's first proclamation. Yet, without formal acknowledgement, these insights remain speculative, preserved only in private notebooks and oral histories shared among insiders. The veil of secrecy that has long shrouded papal considerations of Mary Magdalene's heritage continues to challenge historians and faithful alike to discern how deeply her voice might yet shape the future of the Church. In response to growing scholarly and devotional interest in Mary Magdalene's authentic legacy, grassroots movements have formed under the banner of the Magdala Initiative, dedicated to advancing research, education, and pilgrimage. Founded in 2015 by a coalition of archaeologists, theologians, and heritage professionals, the initiative operates as a non-profit network spanning Israel, Europe, and the Americas. Its primary project involves systematic excavation of Magdala's periphery areas. Beyond the synagogue citato, uncover residences and communal structures that may yield inscriptions or artifacts linked to early Christian households. Collaborating with local authorities, the initiative has employed ground-penetrating radar and drone surveys to map subterranean ruins, identifying potential locations for new ritual baths and domestic courtyards where Mary may have lived. Beyond archaeology, the Magdala Initiative sponsors interdisciplinary conferences that bring together church leaders, pilgrims, and academic experts. In 2018, a landmark symposium at the Studium Biblicum Franciscanum in Jerusalem convened presentations on gender in earliest Christianity, resulting in the publication of essays advocating for Mary's restored recognition in liturgical texts. Educational outreach includes digital platforms offering virtual reality tours of reconstructed Magdala, incorporating audio narratives drawn from apocryphal sources, archaeological reports, and feminist theological reflections. These immersive experiences allow users to walk the streets Mary once traversed, hear the lapping of the lake against stone, and encounter interactive representations of first-century social life. The initiative also supports ordained and lay women seeking new roles in ministry, offering scholarships for theological study and organizing ecumenical retreats centered on Mary's example of proclamation and service. Through partnerships with dioceses in Argentina, the Philippines, and parts of Africa, local chapters host Magdalene Days, combining scholarly lectures with liturgies that blend ancient chants and modern compositions, mindful to honor both historical complexity and contemporary faith. As the Magdala Initiative grows, it embodies a holistic approach. Archaeology inseparable from theology, scholarship paired with spirituality, local heritage linked to global community. In doing so, it keeps alive Mary Magdalene's true story and ensures that her legacy continues to inspire new generations. In obscure corners of Christian tradition, liturgical practices honoring Mary Magdalene survived beyond the official suppression of her apostolic role. During the 16th and 17th centuries, convents and lay fraternities preserved chants and prayers attributed to early communities while masking their origin under innocuous titles. In Spain, archival research at the monastery of Montserrat revealed a 17th century codex containing an Office of the Magdalene, sung in Latin with interspersed vernacular lines, celebrating her witness at the empty tomb. The text describes Mary's proclamation of the resurrection to trembling disciples and petitions her intercession to strengthen beleaguered believers. Although the codex was hidden for centuries and only rediscovered in 1984, its melodies echo the structure of canonical offices, suggesting that women's communities once exercised authority in defining sacred worship. In rural Italy, oral traditions recorded in the 1800s recount that during La Festa della Maddalena, local priests permitted women to lead processions, carrying banners inscribed with scriptural verses in praise of Mary's fearless testimonion. Allowance attributed to papal dispensations granted to isolated parishes. Scholars of comparative liturgy have identified parallel practices among Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, where a Synaxarion compiled in the early 19th century includes homilies crediting Mary with interpreting Christ's teachings for the other apostles. These texts, though never recognized by the hierarchy, reveal a parallel structure of devotion. Ethnomusicologists studying rare recordings of Byzantine chant from Mount Athos monasteries have unearthed references to a women's choir that sang alternate verses about Mary Magdalene's exorcisms and evangelism verses omitted from official hymnals. In contemporary times, small communities have resurrected hidden liturgies in ecumenical settings, incorporating elements from these scattered sources into prayer services. By reconstructing these lost offices, worshippers encounter a richer tapestry of early Christian worship tone, in which Mary Magdalene stood not only as a mourner, but as a leader shaping the song of faith itself. In an age of streaming media and viral narratives, Mary Magdalene's story has entered the realm of pop culture in ways that both illuminate and obscure her authentic legacy. Beginning in the 1990s with films such as The Last Temptation of Christ and later Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, her figure was portrayed with intense emotion, yet largely through the lens of her penitential legend. The blockbuster phenomenon of the Da Vinci Code in 2003 propelled her into a new spotlight, spawning documentaries, podcasts, and television series that speculated on her relationship with Jesus and the existence of secret bloodlines. These popular treatments often blend fact, fiction, and conjecture drawing on apocryphal fragments, yet sensationalizing them for mass audiences. Social media platforms have since given rise to grassroots movements and digital pilgrimages, virtual tours of Magdala's archaeological site, illustrated timelines of Gnostic texts, and interactive maps marking locations tied to her legend, from Provence to Ephesus. Content creators host live-streamed Bible archaeology expeditions, inviting global audiences to witness excavations and artifact analysis in real time. Meanwhile, graphic novels and historical dramas reimagine Mary as a woman of agency and intellect, weaving her voice into dialogues that challenge patriarchal hierarchies, however fictionalized those portrayals may be. Pop-up exhibits in art museums pair Renaissance masterpieces with augmented reality installations that reveal hidden layers suggestive of her apostolic role. Critics argue that such treatments risk further distorting her true story for entertainment value, yet they undeniably keep her memory alive in public consciousness. Academics and church leaders have begun collaborating with filmmakers and game designers to produce content that balances scholarly rigor with engaging storytelling, such as documentary series that juxtapose dramatic reenactments with expert interviews or immersive role-playing experiences that guide participants through first-century Galilean society. In this convergence of culture and technology, Mary Magdalene remains both symbol and subject, her narrative adapted for each new medium yet still beckoning seekers to discern historical reality from mythic embellishment. Mary Magdalene's influence extends beyond Christian traditions, resonating in Islamic and Eastern Orthodox contexts that often preserve elements of her story lost in Western Catholicism. In Islam, Mary Magdalene is not named, yet exegetes acknowledge a woman from among the disciples who witnessed Jesus' resurrection, drawing on Quranic verses 5, 111, 115, that honor those closest to the Prophet. Classical Islamic commentaries by scholars such as al-Tabari, 839, 923 CE, and al-Qurtubi, 1214, 1273 CE, interpret these passages to include female followers renowned for piety and devotion, suggesting a spiritual kinship with the Magdalene figure venerated by Christians. Their writings emphasize her steadfast faith as exemplary for all believers, highlighting a shared reverence that transcends doctrinal divides. In Eastern Orthodoxy, Mary Magdalene occupies a prominent place among the myrrh-bearers, celebrated in the liturgical calendar with hymns that extol her courage in bringing spices to the tomb. Orthodox iconography often depicts her in rich color, her face illuminated by the light of the risen Christ. And services such as the Paschal Matins feature stichera composed by hymnographers like Romanos, the melodist, c. 490–556 CE, praising her as Apostle of the Apostles. Eastern traditions also preserve apocryphal texts such as the Slavonic life of Mary Magdalene, dating to the late medieval period, in which she is credited with founding the first Byzantine monastery on Lesbos and serving as abbess. This narrative, while not universally recognized, reflects an enduring Orthodox appreciation for her leadership. In Coptic Christianity, the Synaxarion of Upper Egypt includes accounts of Mary's relics being transported and enshrined, with miracles recorded at her resting placestries omitted in Western martyrologies. Contemporary interfaith dialogues have brought Muslim, Orthodox, and Catholic scholars together to explore these convergences, hosting conferences that examine shared themes of discipleship, martyrdom, and resurrection witness. Such dialogues underscore how Mary Magdalene's example fosters mutual understanding, inviting communities to recognize her as a bridge between traditions, a testament to faith's transformative power across religious boundaries. In the early 21st century, as scholarly and ecclesiastical debates intensified over Mary Magdalene's role, a landmark confrontation unfolded between progressive theologians and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. At a forum convened by the Pontifical Lateran University in 2017, feminist scholars presented papers arguing that Mary's prophetic witness and teaching ministry should inform contemporary discussions of women's roles in the Church. Drawing on recently translated Gnostic texts and archaeological reports from Magdala, they proposed a re-examination of doctrinal positions that had long excluded women from ordained ministry. In response, officials from the Roman dicastery issued an authoritative statement reaffirming traditional teachings on the sacrament of orders, emphasizing that only men could validly receive priestly ordination. The clash intensified when a public letter signed by over 200 theologians called for the recognition of a female diaconate, citing parallels between Mary's ministry and the earliest Christian deaconesses documented in patristic writings. The congregation's 2019 declaration acknowledged the historical existence of women deacons, but maintained that their functions differed from those of ordained clergy, signaling caution about restoring such roles. This dialogue reached new heights at the 2020 Synod on Synodality, where delegates from around the world shared testimonies of laywomen volunteering as lectors and catechists in parishes facing clergy shortages. They invoked Mary's example as the first messenger of the resurrection, urging synodal assemblies to consider her precedent as a theological foundation for expanded ministry. Although the final synodal document stopped short of endorsing ordination of women, it called for deeper study and ongoing listening. The theological showdown between advocates and the Vatican underscored the enduring tension between tradition and reform, as both sides sought to balance fidelity to doctrine with responsiveness to contemporary insights. Mary Magdalene's story remains at the heart of this debate, her legacy challenging the Church to discern whether her pioneering ministry can inspire fresh expressions of service and leadership today. In recent years, unprecedented access to previously sealed Vatican dossiers has shed new light on how successive pontificates managed Mary Magdalene's complex legacy. Through a rare agreement with the Vatican secret archives, a team of historians examined correspondence, internal memoranda, and liturgical draft revisions spanning the 20th century. Among these documents are 1,964 reports from the Congregation for the Discipline of the Sacraments, detailing proposed amendments to the Martyrologium Romanum, which would have expanded Mary's feast to acknowledge her role as first witness in initiative, ultimately stymied by concerns over theological consistency. A 1,980 internal memo from the Pontifical Council for Culture reveals discussions about issuing a scholarly communiqué on the archaeological findings at Magdala, only to be withdrawn under pressure from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which feared public misunderstanding. Minutes from a 1,995 meeting of the Congregation for Divine Worship include marginal notes debating whether to reinstate an optional Magdalene preface in the Missal, reflecting a tension between pastoral sensitivity and doctrinal fidelity. Perhaps most striking is a 2006 secret report compiled by the Pontifical Biblical Commission that catalogs marginal annotations in early patristic manuscripts, suggesting that even official translators wrestled with excising references to Mary's apostolic authority. These archival revelations demonstrate that behind the liturgical facade, high-ranking officials engaged repeatedly with the question of how best to present Mary's image oscillating between cautious acknowledgement of historical scholarship and retreat to traditional formulations. They also reveal a pattern of incremental study without formal promulgation, leaving Mary's restored legacy to unfold piecemeal through academic channels rather than through definitive magisterial statements. As Vatican archivists continue to process unopened collections, theologians and faithful alike anticipate further insights into the delicate balance between preserving doctrinal integrity and honoring the fullness of Mary Magdalene's witness. Across centuries of veneration, many miraculous accounts attributed to Mary Magdalene languished in obscure records or oral tradition, only to be rediscovered in recent decades through careful historical and anthropological research. In 17th century Provençal chronicles, scribes recorded healings at the shrine of Sainte Marie de la Mer, where pilgrims reported cures of blindness, paralysis, and mysterious fevers after touching relics said to belong to Mary's companions. These accounts survived in parish registers until the French Revolution, when revolutionary fervor led to the destruction of many church archives. In the late 20th century, folklorists exhumed portions of these registers from private collections, confirming that dozens of miracle petitions had once been officially recorded and authenticated by ecclesiastical tribunals. Similarly, Records from a 17th century Venetian confraternity reveal that a reliquary purported to contain a fragment of Mary's hair was credited with ending a deadly plague in 1630, a narrative preserved in civic annals and rediscovered in the Archivio di Stato di Venezia. In the 20th century, renewal of interest in these traditions led to academic conferences on Magdalene miracles, where historians presented case studies of documented cures and intercessory prayers. Anthropologists have observed that rural Catholic communities in southern Italy continued to commemorate local legend-sun-edited mass prayers, processions carrying a statue of Mary with an ointment jar, and reenactments of the myrrh-bearing pilgrimage rituals that often culminated in witnesses testifying to inexplicable recoveries. More recently, medical historians have scrutinized these accounts, distinguishing psychosomatic phenomena from genuinely unexplained healings, while theologians reflect on their significance for understanding the continuity of Mary's compassionate presence. In the digital age, scholars and devotees collaborate online, compiling databases of miracle narratives linked to Mary Magdalene, using geotagged testimonies, scanned archival images, and recorded interviews with descendants of miraculous witness families. These collective efforts reveal that while institutional recognition of such miracles has remained cautious, the popular memory of Mary's intercessory power endures as a vibrant testament to her ongoing spiritual presence. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here, subscribe. In our contemporary world, Mary Magdalene's voice resonates anew, offering a message of compassion, inclusion, and the transformative power of personal encounter. Surveys and sociological studies indicate that a growing number of Christians and many outside formal religious affiliations find inspiration in Mary's example of steadfast witness and empathetic service. In urban centers, grassroots ministries invoke her legacy in programs serving refugees, the homeless, and survivors of trauma, often naming these initiatives Magdalene Houses to embody her spirit of healing and hospitality. Digital platforms, podcasts, blogs, and social media channels feature reflections on Mary's encounter with the risen Christ as a template for interfaith dialogue and spiritual growth. Religious educators incorporate her story into curricula that emphasize restorative justice, gender equity, and environmental stewardship, illustrating how her ministry transcended social barriers and honored the dignity of all people. In theological circles, theologians propose that Mary's example challenges churches to embrace a more synodal model of decision-making, valuing listening and relational discernment over centralized authority. Liturgical innovations appear in experimental services that incorporate readings from the Gospel of Mary alongside canonical texts, inviting worshipers to consider alternative perspectives on resurrection and mission. Retreat centers offer Magdalene pilgrimages that combine silent reflection with guided study of earlier chapters of her life, fostering spiritual renewal rooted in historical awareness. Even among those outside Christian traditions, Mary's narrative of redemption and enduring witness inspires artists, writers, and activists who draw upon her story to advocate for social transformation. Psychiatric chaplaincy programs utilize her image as a model of compassionate presence, training chaplains to accompany patients with the same empathy she showed at the tomb. In each of these manifestations, Mary Magdalene's message today calls us to embody resilience, in the face of suffering, to proclaim hope where despair seems to reign, and to recognize that the first witness of the resurrection remains an archetype of service, proclamation, and profound human solidarity. In recent decades, a growing chorus of scholars, clergy, and lay faithful has called upon the papacy to offer a formal acknowledgement of Mary Magdalene's silenced legacy. The notion of a papal apology first gained traction in 2000 when Francis William G. Byron published an essay urging Pope John Paul II to recognize the historical conflation of Mary with the unnamed sinful woman and to restore her apostolic status in official teaching. While the Vatican responded with respectful silence, the conversation resurfaced during the 2008 Synod of Bishops on the Word of God, where a small group of delegates submitted a proposal to include a reference to Mary's first proclamation of the resurrection in the general instruction of the Liturgy of the Hours. Although this amendment was not adopted, it prompted the Congregation for Divine Worship to commission a study on the impact of gendered language in liturgical texts. In 2016, a petition signed by over 50 theologians and supported by dozens of dioceses asked Pope Francis to issue a pastoral letter acknowledging the centuries of erasure Mary endured and to commission renewed scholarship on her role. Vatican spokesman issued a brief statement reaffirming Mary Magdalene's importance as disciple and evangelist, yet stopped short of formal apology, citing concerns over ecclesial unity and doctrinal precision. Critics argued that a papal apology could open the door to further revisions of traditional narratives, while supporters maintained that it would embody the Church's commitment to truth and reconciliation. Behind the scenes, informal discussions among curial officials and theologians explored possible language for an apology that would honor Mary's witness without implying doctrinal error by past leaders. Though no formal document has yet emerged, Pope Francis's establishment of the Commission for the Study of the Diaconate of Women in 2020 is widely viewed as a step toward acknowledging women's historical contributions in act. Some interpret as an implicit apology regarding Mary's suppression. Whether or not an explicit papal apology will be forthcoming remains uncertain, but the persistent advocacy underscores a widespread desire within the Church to reconcile with the authentic witness of its first apostle. In the wake of feminist theological scholarship and grassroots advocacy, the question of women's ordination has emerged as a defining issue for many Christian denominations, a movement that looks to Mary Magdalene's example as its foundational inspiration. Beginning in the mid-20th century, Protestant churches, such as the United Church of Canada, 1968, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, 1970, and the Anglican Communion's General Synod, 1974, began to ordain women to the diaconate and priesthood, citing Mary's role as the first messenger of the resurrection and the earliest model of apostolic ministry. These developments emboldened Catholic theologians and lay groups to call for a similar restoration within their own tradition. In 1984, members of the International Union of Superiors General presented a petition to the Vatican seeking recognition of early Christian deaconesses, among whom Mary Magdalene stood as a paradigmatic figure. Although Pope John Paul II's 1994 Apostolic Letter, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, reaffirmed the Church's teaching that priestly ordination is reserved to men, it also encouraged deeper study of women's ministry and the historical orders of service. This led to Pope Francis's 2016 establishment of a commission to study the diaconate of women, which presented its findings in 2020, acknowledging historical precedents for female service in liturgical and charitable roles. Although the final report did not recommend immediate ordination, it opened the door for expanded ministries, including instituted lectors and acolytes often, seen as preliminary steps toward broader recognition. In regions such as Latin America and parts of Africa, local bishops have authorized pastoral guidelines, allowing women to preside at certain liturgical functions in exceptional circumstances. Ecumenical dialogues at the World Council of Churches and bilateral conversations with Eastern Orthodox churches have highlighted Mary's testimony as a shared touchstone for conversations about ministry. Throughout these developments, advocates emphasize that Mary's commissioning by the risen Christ transcends gender restrictions, demonstrating that spiritual calling and sacramental service should be measured by faithfulness rather than by sex. The women's ordination movement thus remains a testament to Mary Magdalene's enduring legacy, urging the Church to align its practice with the inclusive vision she embodied on the morning of the resurrection. In recent decades, liturgical reformers have sought to recover elements of Mary Magdalene's ministry by reshaping the structure and language of the Mass itself. Beginning in the 1970s, following the Second Vatican Council's call for greater lay participation, some dioceses experimented with allowing instituted lay, ministers both men and women, to proclaim the gospel and prepare the altar, roles that echo Mary's first proclamation of the resurrection. Building on this momentum, theologians and liturgists proposed more substantive revisions, drafting alternative Eucharistic prayers that explicitly reference Mary's witness at the tomb and incorporating readings from the Gospel of Mary into the lectionary as optional texts. In 2002, a pastoral committee in the Archdiocese of Toronto published a study guide for parishes on celebrating a Magdalene Sunday, including a revised preface that honored her commissioning by the risen Christ. Although this proposal remained unofficial and met resistance during sessions of the Congregation for Divine Worship, it inspired similar initiatives in Australia and parts of Europe, where local bishops granted experimental use of these texts. Liturgical composers responded by setting new chants to ancient melodies, crafting an antiphon of the Magdalene that frames the Easter proclamation in feminine imagery. Seminaries and formation programs began offering modules on women at the altar, exploring how early Christian women served in liturgical roles and inviting reflection on restoring those ministries today. Ecumenical services, particularly among Anglican and Lutheran partners, have more openly adopted these texts, illustrating how Mary's example transcends confessional boundaries. While full integration into the Roman Missal has yet to occur, the process of rewriting the Mass continues at grassroots levels through diocesan synods, parish liturgy committees, and online worship communities. Each adaptation seeks to balance fidelity to tradition with recovery of silenced voices, ensuring that the celebration of the Eucharist reflects the full diversity of the apostolic witness. In the ongoing quest to reclaim Mary Magdalene's voice, some scholars and liturgists have proposed the creation of a Gospel of Mary, formally recognized alongside canonical texts for study and contemplation. Building on fragments of the apocryphal Gospel of Mary discovered at Akhmim and Nag Hammadi texts dating from the mid-2nd to early 3rd centuries, Sethes' effort seeks to assemble a coherent narrative of her teachings, drawing on scholarly reconstructions, patristic citations, and Gnostic homilies. Advocates argue that such a work would not function as a replacement for the fourfold gospel, but as a complementary text, illuminating facets of early Christian thought suppressed by the consolidation of orthodoxy. In 2010, an international colloquium at the École Biblique in Jerusalem brought together experts in Coptic studies, patristics, and liturgical theology to draft a proposed schema. Introductory essays situating Mary's context, translations of extant fragments, and creative reconstructions of missing passages based on thematic parallels in canonical and non-canonical writings. Workshop participants emphasized rigorous scholarly standards, employing textual criticism, rhetorical analysis, and comparative theology to ensure fidelity to the earliest manuscripts. Parallel projects in digital humanities have created annotated online editions, integrating high-resolution images of papyrus fragments with multi-layered translations and interactive commentaries. Some ecumenical study groups have begun using these materials in adult education programs, inviting participants to read reconstructed passages alongside Luke and John, and to discuss what Mary's perspectives reveal about Christ's message of liberation and healing. Although the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has not formally endorsed such a gospel, unofficial pilot programs and seminaries, and lay movements such as the Mary of Magdala initiative, have demonstrated that this new text can foster deeper engagement with the roots of Christian tradition. By laying out a path for Mary's teachings to be studied in community, the New Gospel Initiative embodies the very spirit of proclamation she exemplified at the tomb, inviting the modern Church to listen once more to its first apostle of hope. Throughout Christian history, conceptions of God have largely employed masculine imagery: Father, King, Lord. Yet early texts and artistic traditions hint at a divine fullness encompassing both masculine and feminine dimensions. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Syriac manuscript known as the Acts of Thomas portrays Jesus speaking of the Mother who gave birth to all creation, a title that, while later suppressed, reflects an embryonic theology of the divine feminine. The Gospel of Mary likewise preserves Mary Magdalene's account of secret teachings, in which she describes wisdom personified as a woman in Jewish scripturus, an agent of salvation working alongside the Word. Medieval mystics such as Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen expanded on these themes, using maternal metaphors to depict Christ as mother who nurtures and comforts her children, imagery that remained confined to private vision accounts rather than public worship. In the Renaissance, humanist scholars recovered fragments of these earlier sources, yet the institutional church maintained strict boundaries on attributing feminine titles to God. It was not until the 20th century, amid feminist theological discourse, that proposals emerged to introduce inclusive language in liturgy. The 1979 Book of Common Prayer in the Episcopal Church offered optional references to God as parent, and some Protestant denominations followed suit with hymns and prayers invoking both mother and father. In Catholic circles, theologians have explored the Mariological tradition devotion to Mary, the Theotokos, as a gateway to appreciating feminine aspects of the divine, though formal liturgical language remains unchanged. Contemporary scholars draw on dynamism in Coptic iconography, where the figure of Mary Magdalene sometimes appears beside Christ Pantocrator, symbolizing a partnership in divine mission. Interfaith dialogues further enrich this vision, comparing Christian feminine imagery with Hindu, Lakshmi, and Buddhist Tara, revealing common threads of compassion, wisdom, and active presence. By recovering these layers of tradition, modern believers rediscover that the divine transcends gender while embracing its full expression. Mary Magdalene's restored legacy as apostle and teacher invites the Church to reconsider how inclusive language and imagery might reflect the totality of God's self-revelation. In a world marked by denominational divides, Mary Magdalene's story resonates across Christian traditions, fostering dialogue and unity that mirror her own bridging of barriers in the earliest Church. In the mid-20th century, the World Council of Churches began convening bilateral commissions between Catholic and Orthodox delegates. Lutherans and Anglicans, where Mary's role as first witness provided common ground for exploring shared heritage. Documents such as the Lima Report, 1982, reference the undaunted proclamation of the Magdalene when articulating a vision for joint witness in the modern world. In Eastern Orthodoxy, the Synod of Crete, 2016, affirmed Mary's veneration alongside the other myrrh-bearers, emphasizing her apostolic example as emblematic of lay participation in the gospel mission. Protestant bodies, too, have incorporated her narrative in ecumenical worship resources, with Lutheran and Methodist liturgical committees, including optional readings from the reconstructed Gospel of Mary in joint Easter celebrations. Academic institutions like the Center for Ecumenical Studies in Geneva host conferences on women in the early Church, where scholars from diverse confessions present converging evidence of Mary's leadership and its implications for contemporary unity. Even among non-Christian faiths, interreligious gatherings on women's spiritual leadership draw on her example. Jewish, Christian dialogues explore female discipleship in rabbinic and early Christian contexts, while Muslim Christian forums discuss parallel respect for devout female followers in both traditions. These ecumenical echoes demonstrate that Mary's authentic legacy transcends doctrinal boundaries and invites collaborative reflection on gender, ministry, and the nature of apostolic witness. By reclaiming her story together, churches discover not only a richer understanding of their common past, but also a shared commitment to inclusive mission in the world today. Across the centuries, Mary Magdalene's example has inspired movements for social justice and human dignity, embodying a legacy of liberation that transcends ecclesial walls. In the 19th century, abolitionists like Lucretia Mott drew on her narrative of transformation to argue against slavery, portraying Mary's release from demonic exile as emblematic of freedom from bondage. During the early 20th century suffrage campaigns, leaders such as Alice Paul invoked Magdalene's bold proclamation of the resurrection to bolster women's enfranchisement, framing the vote as a necessary participation in society's moral renewal. In the civil rights era, Black churches celebrated her as a model of courageous witness, singing spirituals that likened her tears at the cross to the laments of the oppressed, and honoring her as apostle of hope in the face of segregation. Liberation theologians in Latin America and Africa have likewise drawn parallels between Mary's solidarity with the marginalized and Christ's preferential option for the poor, integrating her story into grassroots-based communities and justice ministries. In contemporary activism, NGOs and faith-based organizations name programs Magdalene projects to serve survivors of human trafficking, recognizing her history of deliverance from exploitation. Artists and writers in marginalized communities depict her as a sister in suffering who leads through compassion and resilience. By weaving her narrative into struggles for racial, economic, and gender justice, these movements reclaim Mary Magdalene's authentic witness as a call to collective freedom. Rest your mind, you've earned it. Tonight we've traced Mary Magdalene's journey from marginalized witness to rediscovered apostle, unveiling how her voice was silenced by power yet endured through hidden texts, art, and devotion. Her story reminds us that truth can be buried, but never fully extinguished, that a single woman's steadfast proclamation changed the world's trajectory. In our own time, her legacy calls us to listen for silenced voices, to question inherited narratives, and to reclaim the fullness of our shared history. Mary's example urges us to embody compassion in the face of indifference, to speak boldly when systems demand our silence, and to honor each person's God-given dignity. As we close this chapter, let her courage inspire us to lift veils of suppression, whether in church, society, or within our own heart's sand, to build communities marked by mutual respect and shared witness. Her story is not simply a relic of the past, but a living invitation to proclaim hope, to serve with humility, and to trust that even in the darkest tomb, life can emerge. In recounting Mary Magdalene's journey from devoted follower to silenced apostle and finally to modern emblem of resilience, we recognize that her story is woven into the very fabric of human striving. Across 2,000 years, patriarchal decrees sought to confine her to the margins, yet her authentic voice survived in clandestine manuscripts, in the unshaded corners of frescoes, and in the hearts of those who refused to let her witness fade. Today, scholars unearth fragments of her teaching. Artists reclaim her image as guide and mentor. Activists emulate her courage in challenging injustice. Her life teaches us that transformation begins with a single act of faith, that systemic change often arises from hidden networks of solidarity, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can surface to renew communities. As we face our own moment of social upheaval and spiritual searching, Mary's example invites us to listen for unheard narratives, to honor the wisdom of those long suppressed, and to commit ourselves to the work of liberation in every chamber of power. Her proclamation at the empty tomb remains the foundational moment of hope in Christian memory, yet it also speaks universally to human hearts longing for renewal. By embracing her legacy in scholarship, worship, and social action, we affirm that every voice matters in the shared unfolding of history. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.